The alarm did not sound. No siren tore through the sterilized air of the council chamber. The trap was set in absolute silence, wrapped in diplomatic velvet and adorned with the language of peace. Admiral Helena Vance realized this only when it was too late for the ambassador to retreat. Sometimes the deadliest danger doesn't arrive with the roar of war engines, but with the soft whisper of an agreement. The chamber was built 500 years ago with a single architectural purpose: to make any visitor feel the weight of their own insignificance. The walls curved inward in arches that defied conventional geometry, formed by a translucent material that captured and redistributed light from artificial stars arranged in constellations of 200 different species. The ceiling vanished hundreds of feet above, and there, in that calculated void, human sound died before finding an echo. Vance had served in 3 low-intensity wars in the farthest reaches of explored space. She had traversed battle debris fields and navigated nebulae with enough radiation to sterilize planets. But none of these experiences had prepared her lungs for the simple task of breathing with dignity inside that room. Beside her, Ambassador Diana Page stood with the impeccable posture that 20 years of diplomatic career sculpts into the spine. Page was a woman in her 50s, with short-cropped black hair, eyes that conveyed a calm that Vance had learned over months of working together not to mistake for coldness. Page felt everything. She had simply decided, at some point in her life, that feeling was a tool to be used at the right moment, not a permanent state to be displayed. In front of them, on a raised platform requiring 6 steps of an unnamed black stone, Senior Counselor Vreth Allen moved with the characteristic fluidity of the Valinari. Their species had existed for a time that made human history not just young, but infantile. Vreth Allen had 4 articulated arms with joints that bent in 3 independent directions, skin of a silvery gray that the light of the artificial stars transformed into something almost luminous, and compound eyes of 17 facets each, eyes that registered spectra beyond human vision. When they spoke, the universal translator hanging from Vance's ear processed the frequencies and delivered them as a deep, serene, gender-neutral voice, specifically calibrated to cause comfort in mammalian ears. "Representatives of Earth," Vreth Allen said, opening 2 of their 4 arms in a gesture that the translator identified as the Valinari equivalent of a respectful bow, "the Galactic Concord acknowledges 30 years of human contribution to the stability of this sector of the spiral arm. The speed with which your people have absorbed interstellar communication protocols, adapted their biology for warp travel, and integrated their political structures into concord patterns has exceeded all projections from our interspecies relations academies." Page inclined her head with exactly the degree of humility the situation demanded. Vance remained still, her thumbs hooked into her uniform belt, observing the 342 representatives of other species arranged in the semicircular rows of the chamber. She was an admiral in the Unified Earth Space Navy. She had spent her career learning to read rooms, and this room, at this moment, exuded something her military instincts classified with a single word: expectation. Not the expectation of someone awaiting an unknown answer, the expectation of someone who already knows what is going to happen. "Therefore," Vreth Allen continued, "the Concord Security Council wishes to present to the Earth delegation the Unified Disarmament and Trust Agreement." A hologram expanded in the center of the chamber. Vance processed the data in real time. In exchange for a permanent seat on the Security Council, unrestricted access to 5th-generation propulsion technologies, sharing of medical data that, according to Ministry of Health estimates, could eradicate 19 categories of human degenerative diseases, and voting power in all frontier deliberations, Earth was to transfer its primary war fleet to a joint peacekeeping force under Unified Concord Command. 2,400 ships. The backbone of human defense. "Joint Operational Command," Vreth Allen said with that voice calibrated for comfort, "will ensure that no member species needs to fear another. Trust is the foundation upon which we build galactic civilization." Vance felt heat rise up her neck. It wasn't anger, it was recognition. She had studied disarmament treaties throughout human history. She had read about how empires collapsed not on battlefields, but in conference rooms, when leaders driven by the vision of a better future signed documents that surrendered sovereignty in exchange for promises. The phrasing was always the same: trust, cooperation, lasting peace. The words were beautiful. The intentions sometimes were genuine. The result often was not. Paige turned slightly to her, just enough so the movement wouldn't be registered by protocol cameras. Her eyes posed a question. Vance held up 2 fingers of her right hand, the coded gesture between them that meant, "I need time." Paige blinked once. Confirmation received. The ambassador turned her face back to Vreth Allen and began to speak with diplomatic precision, requesting a 48-hour period to consult Earth government mandates. But while Paige bought time with elegant words, Vance had already begun to work. She discreetly activated the wrist micro-device, sending a coded 3-pulse signal to the frigate awaiting them in stationary orbit. The code was simple: anchor protocol, start checking. The offer was too generous. And in Helena Vance's experience, when something is too generous, there's always a second layer you haven't yet seen. As they left the chamber, walking down corridors lined with a material that absorbed footsteps and transformed them into silence, Paige spoke in a low voice without turning her face. "Do you think it's real?" "The offer is real," Vance said. "It's the motivation that worries me. No one gives up so much power without a reason we haven't yet put on the table." Paige was quiet for 3 full steps. What if the reason is exactly what they say? Stability, trust. Then it will be the first time in recorded history, human or alien, that the powerful have yielded strategic advantage out of pure altruism. Vance paused. "But I'm not ruling out the hypothesis." What she didn't say, because there was no proof yet, was what her instincts screamed with the brutal clarity of an emergency engine igniting in a vacuum. "They are not offering us a seat at the table. They are removing us from the board." Somewhere deep within the chamber they had left behind, Vreth Allen folded all 4 arms and watched the human representatives depart. Beside them, a tiny Korvath species aide with unblinking black eyes whispered something on high frequencies beyond the range of the human translator. Vreth Allen's reply was brief, and its English equivalent, if someone could translate, would be simply this: "They will come. They always come." Ambassador Paige signed the Unified Disarmament and Trust Agreement on the 14th day after the chamber session. Vance was present at the ceremony in full uniform, medallions aligned with the precision of binary code. She made no formal objection. She had argued through internal channels, had documented her reservations in 3 memos that went up the chain of command and returned with superior approval notes. The decision was made. The Earth government, led by democratically elected representatives of billions of people who genuinely wanted an integrated galactic future, had chosen hope. Vance respected that. She didn't agree, but she respected it. She spent the next 4 days doing what she always did when she couldn't control an outcome, preparing the groundwork for when the outcome failed. The fleet transfer was scheduled for the 18th day. The 2,400 ships of Earth's primary fleet left orbit in staggered groups, each group headed by a veteran captain who had received clear orders from Unified Command. Professional transition, no incidents, protocol cameras present on all command decks. It was a showcase. Humanity showing the universe that it honored its commitments. Captain Marcus Webb commanded the flagship of the 3rd group, the UESS Resolute Heavy Cruiser. 32 years of service, survivor of the Battle of Mira Corridor, a man who had fixed a warp drive with parts from an industrial kitchen and reached his destination with only a 40-minute deviation from schedule. The Resolute's crew had an expression to describe Webb. He didn't solve problems, he converted them into solutions the problem hadn't yet realized existed. Webb arrived at Orth 7 relay station at the vanguard of the third group, as protocol dictated. The station was a colossal structure, a 3-kilometer diameter disk suspended at the stable gravitational point between two secondary star systems. It was technically neutral territory, designated as a transfer zone by the Concord. There were Valinari, Korvath, and representatives from 4 other Security Council member species. There were flags. In all visual frequencies the present species could register. There was a formal reception prepared on the station's upper decks. Webb docked the Resolute in the designated docking bay, completed mooring protocols, and then did something that wasn't on the script. He asked his communications officer, Lieutenant Yara Osei, to run a passive scan of the station's communication systems. There was no official reason for it. It was just the instinct of a man who had survived 32 years in active service by never stopping observing. Osei ran the scan. It took 11 minutes. When the results appeared on the screen, she looked at Webb. Webb looked at the screen. They stayed like that for 4 seconds. "Captain," Osei said, with the voice of someone reading a report they'd rather not have requested, "the station's external communication protocols show an anomaly. Transmission frequencies to Earth's internal systems are being routed through a non-standard latency filter." "In practical terms," Webb said, "in practical terms, if someone wanted to cut off our communications with Earth in a way that looked like a gradual technical failure rather than an active blockade, they would use exactly this filter." Webb stood for a moment, hands on the navigation console, looking out the panoramic window at the other human ships settling into the docking bays around the station like birds landing on a branch. 2,400 ships, 183,000 crew members. "Osei," he said, "give me the redundant low-frequency emergency channel. The kind we used for submarine communication in the first decades of space exploration. A frequency so antiquated, I doubt the Concorde bothered to filter it." Osei found the frequency in 40 seconds. Webb dictated an 18-word message in code, a system based on 20th century human literary references that required Earth cultural context to decode. Then he gave the order for the crew to prepare for the reception ceremony, adjusted his uniform collar, and went to the honor deck as if nothing had happened. The ceremony lasted 3 hours. There were speeches, exchanges of symbolic insignias, and the formal moment when the captains handed over the access crystals containing each ship's command codes. Webb handed his over with a firm handshake to the designated Valinari representative, looked into the being's 17-faceted eyes, and smiled with the cordiality of a man who had decided, during the 3 hours of the ceremony, what he was going to do next. It was 20 minutes after the ceremony ended, when the human delegations were still on the reception deck drinking a substance the hosts called celebration fluid, and which tasted, in Webb's estimation, like antifreeze with ambition, that the station's communication systems altered in a coordinated manner. It wasn't an abrupt cut. It was a gradual degradation, as Osei's filter had predicted. In 42 minutes, transmissions to Earth would be within background noise. In 80 minutes, they would be indistinguishable from the silence of space. Webb was back on the Resolute's command deck when the filter completed its first phase. "Osei," he said, "did the 18-word message arrive?" "Receipt confirmation received 4 minutes ago, sir. I believe it was the last transmission we managed to receive before the degradation completed the first cycle." Webb nodded. He looked at the screen showing the status of the 2,400 human ships distributed throughout the station's docking bays. They were there, intact, crewed, functioning. But the access crystals that made them obey human command were now in the possession of representatives of a Concorde that had, deliberately and methodically, begun to silence their connection to home. They weren't prisoners yet. But the door had begun to close. Webb opened the bottom drawer of the navigation console and pulled out an object that seemed to have no place on a 28th century warship. A physical book, printed on paper, with a synthetic leather hardcover. It was a pocket edition of a 20th century science fiction novel. He opened it to page 143, where there was a passage underlined in pencil with tiny handwriting in the margins. The annotation read, "When you cannot fight the system, build a new one." It was Helena Vance's handwriting. She had left the book in Webb's cabin 3 weeks before the agreement was signed, without comment, without explanation. Just the book on the table, open to that page. Webb closed the book. He looked into the dark mirror of the panoramic window, where his own reflection looked back. 32 years of service. A warp drive fixed with kitchen parts. And now this. He took a deep breath, the kind of breath that precedes not fear, but resolution. "Osei," he said, "start documenting everything, every anomaly, every deviation from protocol, every microsecond of non-standard latency. If we're going to get out of here, we're going to get out with proof." "And if we don't, sir?" Webb put the book back in the drawer. "Then the proof will arrive without us. But Admiral Vance will get the message anyway. She always gets the message. Somewhere 180,000 kilometers away in the central control chamber of Orth 7 Relay Station, a Corvath officer checked the communication degradation indicators and recorded a 3-word entry in the station logs. Phase 1 complete. Thomas Royce was not a man of grand narratives. He was a man of cargo manifests, narrow warp windows, and clients who paid on delivery. At 48, he had accumulated enough to own a small ship, the independent freighter Dark Hope, and enough wisdom not to ask about the provenance of certain cargoes that paid triple the standard rate. The universe was complicated. Thomas Royce preferred the simple parts. He was on a secondary route to the Vega 9 system, loaded with industrial components destined for a mining colony, when the proximity sensor registered the first anomalies. Large objects. No active transponder. No distress signal. Commercial logic said, divert, avoid the complication, deliver the cargo on time. Thomas Royce was, fundamentally, a man of commercial logic. But there was something in the pattern of the objects that irritated the side of his mind, that recognized shapes before his conscious brain finished processing. They were large. Very large. And the distribution pattern was not that of natural debris. He slowed to suborbital speed and asked the navigation system for a silhouette profile. It took 18 seconds. The answer arrived with a 94% confidence rating and a label that Royce read 3 times before he believed it. Earth-class warships. 9 of them. Royce put the Dark Hope into passive inspection orbit around the group and spent the next 20 minutes observing. The ships were structurally intact, but something was wrong in a way he couldn't immediately name. The way you sometimes look at a family photograph and it takes a moment to realize the person in the left corner should have died 10 years ago. Then he realized. The weapon deck windows were open, not damaged. Open deliberately, like drawers of an emptied dresser. The particle cannons, the torpedo launchers, the force field emitters, everything had been surgically removed. There were no floating fragments, no signs of combat, no characteristic mess of combat destruction. It was the methodical work of someone carefully and intentionally disassembling equipment, like a watchmaker removing the parts of a mechanism that will no longer be repaired. Royce requested a life support scan. The system took 43 seconds and then produced a report he stared at for almost a minute before realizing he was holding his breath. There were heat signatures. Human. Faint. But present, distributed in patterns corresponding to groups of people gathered in the innermost sectors of the ships, away from the hulls and pressurization joints. The kind of pattern that forms when people with survival training identify an imminent life support failure and instinctively move to the most protected point of the structure. There were survivors. Royce activated the Dark Hope's emergency signal amplification system, the kind independent freighters were required to carry for operations in remote sectors, and transmitted on the standard distress frequency. The response came in 78 seconds, faint, full of static, but comprehensible. It was a human voice, female, exhausted, and what she said was not a plea for help. It was a report. "This is Lieutenant Commander Sophia Anders, UESS Courage, from the 3rd Transfer Group. Recording for the archive. If anyone receives this, transmit it to Earth Command with maximum priority. On the 19th day after fleet transfer, life support systems were remotely altered by the new access controllers. Power cores were decoupled by external commands. Weapon systems had already been physically removed during the first 3 days after transfer. There was no communication, no warning, no evacuation protocol. The voice paused. "We are using 3rd redundancy emergency generators. We have oxygen reserves for approximately 40 hours from this transmission. We are 112 crew members on this ship. The patterns of action on the other 8 ships suggest the situation is identical. This was not a technical error. It was a deliberate policy of capacity reduction." The voice stopped. Then, lower, almost to herself. "Remember us." Royce turned off the recording. He sat in the Dark Hope's pilot's chair, looking at the screen showing the 9 stripped warships floating in the silent vacuum, and felt something that wasn't exactly anger and wasn't exactly fear. It was the clarity that arrives when a situation becomes too simple to ignore. The Dark Hope had emergency docking capacity for up to 48 people. There were 9 ships. There were approximately 900 people distributed among them. The math didn't add up by a factor of 19. Royce opened the general communication channel to the drifting ships. "This is Thomas Royce, independent captain of the freighter Dark Hope, commercial identification TRE 2847. I am in position and can begin rescue operations. My capacity is limited, but I will start with the most critical emergency status. I need each ship to send me an oxygen status report and identify crew members requiring immediate medical attention." While waiting for responses, Royce activated the Dark Hope's long-distance messaging system. The emergency channel registered with the Independent Navigation Agency and began to compose a transmission. Not for the Earth government, whose channels he suspected were compromised. For the network of independent freighters he knew from 15 years of trade routes. For the other Thomas Royces of the universe, men and women of commercial logic who, when things became sufficiently simple, did the sufficiently obvious thing. The message was short. Coordinates, number of survivors, urgency, and 3 words in Spanish that any independent pilot of Latin descent would recognize as the only call that could not be ignored. Necesitan nuestra ayuda. They need our help. Royce was not a man of grand narratives, but he was in the middle of one he had no choice but to finish writing. Over the next 40 hours, while he handled the impossible logistics of transferring 900 people between ships with fractional capacities, 3 things happened simultaneously at 3 different points in human space. On Earth, Captain Webb's 18-word coded message reached the correct recipient. Admiral Helena Vance read the message once, folded the paper, put it in her inner uniform pocket, and requested immediate transport to Mars. At Orth 7 Relay Station, Captain Marcus Webb discovered that the pressurization seals of the docking bays where the human ships were moored had been altered to a protocol that would make autonomous departure technically impossible without authorization from the station's control systems. It was an elegant cage. The birds were still inside. The doors were closed. And deep within Mars, in tunnels sealed by classification codes that very few living people still knew, an automatic maintenance system registered an access sequence that had not been used in 22 years and began, methodically, to illuminate the corridors one by one. General Kofi Mensah had spent the last 7 years doing something the rest of the solar system considered unnecessary, caring for ships no one else wanted. He was the maintenance commander of the Alpha Niner underground complex, and facility classified in open records as obsolete equipment depot, low budgetary priority. In the real language of the Department of Deep Strategy, whose existence was known by exactly 43 people in the Earth government, Alpha Niner was the last resort arsenal, the argument humanity kept in its back pocket for the day all other arguments had failed. Mensah was 55, with completely white hair since 42, and the temperament of a man who had learned, long before any official position, that preventive maintenance is the only honest form of optimism. You didn't believe things would go wrong. You simply prepared, meticulously, for when they did. The difference was the same that separated pessimism from engineering. When the old access sequence illuminated Alpha Niner's corridors and the system announced the presence of an authorized Level 1 visitor, Mensah was on Hangar 7's maintenance deck, personally checking the alignment of the pre-Concorde assault cruiser UESS Horace's particle accelerators. He wiped his hands on the cloth he always carried in his pocket, left the cloth on the diagnostic console, and went to meet the visitor with the calm of someone who had rehearsed this moment in his head more times than he could count. Helena Vance was different. He had known her decades ago when she was a captain and he was a systems engineer at an orbital training base. She had always been intense, focused, the kind of person who seemed to be processing 3 layers of reality simultaneously while conducting a normal conversation. But now there was something more. The focus had a quality Mensah recognized immediately because he saw it in the mirror every morning. It was the focus of someone who had stopped considering alternatives and was entirely committed to a single trajectory. "Kofi," she said, without preamble, without the social rituals the formal situation would normally require. "What do we have?" Mensah responded without hesitation, because he too had been rehearsing. 327 ships operational or capable of operation within 72 hours. 144 that will need a week or more. 58 that are honestly better treated as a source of parts for the others. Of the 327, 290 are armed with systems that have been supplemented with commercially acquired technology during the years of peace. They are not the original systems. They are better. Vance processed. Crews, 112 maintenance personnel with combat classification. None are here by chance. When the Department of Deep Strategy selected personnel for Alpha Niner, they chose people who understood why this place existed. Mensah paused. And there are more if you can get the message through. The message is already on its way. Vance looked at the expanse of the hangar, where the Horus rested under amber maintenance lights, its bluish-gray hull having been transformed into something almost organic by Martian dust over the years. "I'm also awaiting responses from veterans in the reserves, people who didn't surrender everything when the fleet transferred because they had the same instinct as you and I." Alpha Niner's chief engineer, Dr. Priya Neal, arrived on the deck with a holographic tablet and an expression that blended the enthusiasm of an expert finally being called upon for the work she had spent years preparing for with the sobriety of someone who understood the weight of what was being asked. Neal was 40, her hair held back with a diagnostic clip she had clearly forgotten was in her head, and a reputation in propulsion systems engineering networks that crossed the line between competence and art. "Admiral," she said, presenting the tablet, "I conducted a preliminary assessment as soon as the access protocol was activated. There is a problem and an opportunity that are, in fact, the same thing." Vance took the tablet. "Explain." "Pre-Concord ships use system architecture that the Concorde does not recognize. Their electronic warfare algorithms were developed to deal with technology all Concorde members use. Our old fleet uses physical principles that are technically obsolete, but produce completely different signatures." Neal tapped the screen, expanding a diagram comparing energy signatures. "To Concord detection systems, our old ships will appear as background noise or as poorly calibrated commercials, not because they are invisible, because no one in the Concord spent 100 years developing countermeasures for technology they considered outdated. Vance stared at the diagram for 8 seconds. Mensa knew that look. It was the look of someone not processing new information, but recognizing the confirmation of an intuition she had carried for a long time. How long to integrate the commercially acquired systems with the original architecture? Vance asked. For the priority ships? 5 days if we work in 3 shifts. Neil paused. But there's a second component that will sound absurd until you think about it for 30 seconds. Tell me, over the last 30 years of commercial interaction with conquered species, we've absorbed fragments of technology from at least 12 different civilizations, components, protocols, materials. Nothing the government wanted to officially acknowledge because it complicated transfer agreements, but I have them here, studied, cataloged, and in many cases integrated into prototypes that never received official approval because there was no one with enough authority interested in approving them. She pointed to a section of the hangar covered with tarpaulins. Underneath those tarpaulins are 6 hybrid propulsion ship prototypes that don't exist in any Concord catalog. They don't know what they are. They don't know how to detect them. They don't know how to neutralize them. Mensa saw Vance do something she rarely did. She smiled. Not with joy, with the precision of someone who had found the exact tool for the job before her. How many of the reserve crews can be here in 48 hours? Those in the internal Mars system, immediately, Mensa said. Those on Earth and orbital stations, if you release the silent mobilization protocol that doesn't require ministerial authorization? Released. Vance returned the tablet to Neil. I also need a secure channel to Orth 7 relay station. Indirect, untraceable, using pre-Concord protocols. We have a low-frequency tachyon pulse system that the Concord considers physically impossible to use for long-distance communication, Neil said, with the expression of someone about to explain why the impossible is just an engineering problem in disguise. They're not exactly wrong. It's unstable, has a 30% error rate on long transmissions, and requires the receiver to know they're receiving it, or they'll mistake it for background noise. She paused. But if Captain Webb receives the book you supposedly left in his cabin a few weeks ago, and if he's the kind of person who understands that page 143 contains a tachyon reception protocol coded in literary references, he is exactly that kind of person, Vance said. Then we can establish communication. Mensa watched the 2 women align the next steps with the compressed efficiency of those who have no time to waste, and felt something that was difficult to name precisely. It wasn't trust. It was older than that. It was the recognition that humanity had reached this specific moment, because never, in all its history, had it managed to stop preparing for the moment it would need itself. In 48 hours, the first group of veterans would begin to arrive. In 5 days, Dr. Neil would have the priority ships with integrated systems. In 2 weeks, what had been the forgotten arsenal of Mars would be something else entirely. The Sovereign Reckoning fleet was being born in tunnels the universe had forgotten to monitor. The Orth Nebula was, by astronomical standards, young. Only 12,000 years of existence as the gaseous expansion of a star that had decided, dramatically and irresponsibly, to explode without warning. The result was a field of reddish-violet ionized hydrogen clouds, traversed by dust filaments that partially blocked long-range scans and created a geometry of hiding places and revelations that made the region simultaneously the most strategic gateway to the Concord's central systems and the logistical nightmare of any commander who preferred certainty to improvisation. Vance had chosen the Orth Nebula for precisely this reason. The Sovereign Reckoning fleet had left Mars with 286 ships, reinforced during transit by 43 more veteran ships that had responded to the silent mobilization call. There were also Dr. Neil's 6 hybrid prototypes, which technically continued not to exist in any official catalog. And there were 22 independent freighters, including Thomas Royce's Dark Hope, which had arrived with the warships and simply hadn't left, crewed by people who, when asked about their decision, offered variations of the same answer. It seemed necessary. Captain Webb was on the Resolute's command deck via a low-frequency tachyon connection, with a 30% packet loss and a communication delay that made real-time conversations impractical but sufficient for strategic coordination via asynchronous messages. He had spent the last 18 days inside Orth 7 relay station as a guest who knew he was unwelcome but also knew, with mathematical precision, that his hosts needed pretexts to act and were actively preventing him from providing them. It was an uncomfortable dance. Webb was a competent dancer. The Concord Defense Force positioned in the Orth Nebula was substantial. 640 line ships, distributed in a 3-layer formation, Vance had studied in simulations during the journey. An outer layer of deterrence, a middle layer of interception, and a central reserve that depended on the first two to provide positioning information before committing. It was an excellent formation. Vance had spent 2 weeks trying to find a fundamental weakness and finally concluded that, if you fought it the way it expected to be fought, the weakness simply did not exist. So she decided to fight it in ways it had not considered. The first surprise was visibility. Concord detection systems, calibrated to identify the energy signatures of technology they themselves had developed or fought, registered the arrival of the human fleet with an 11-minute delay. Neil had predicted 8. The difference was 3 minutes of positioning, during which the fleet had redistributed into 17 independent groups, each with complete tactical autonomy, each with a different set of mission parameters, but with a single shared objective: to fragment the defense layers before they could communicate effectively with each other. The second surprise was behavior. Concord fleets, as Vance had spent weeks studying, operated on centralized coordination protocols. Each ship reported to Sector Command, received instructions, executed. It was efficient. It was predictable. It was the product of civilizations that had solved the problem of coordination so long ago that the solution had become structural, reflexive, invisible. The human groups did not operate like that. Each group commander had a mission, full authority to adapt the execution, and a single mandatory protocol. If you encounter a situation your parameters don't cover, improvise and document. The result was a battle that the Concord Defense Commander, a high-ranking Valinari called Strategist Veth Kalan, would later describe in internal reports as tactically incoherent in a way that produced results that did not correspond to any combat behavior model recorded in our historical libraries. Group 7, commanded by veteran Captain Amara Diallo, identified a 3-minute and 40-second window in the outer layer's coverage rotation and traversed it not in an attack formation, but in maximum dispersion, making its 11 ships appear on Concord sensors like a cloud of propulsion debris with inconsistent energy anomalies. By the time the outer layer realized what had happened, Group 7 was within the space between the first and second layers, positioned to interfere with coordination communications without having yet fired a single weapon system. Group 2, which included the hybrid prototypes, did something Veth Kalan would call unforgivably unconventional. 2 of the prototypes left the battle at apparent retreat speed, crossed a 240-degree arc around the nebula's outer perimeter, using the dust filaments as passive cover, and reappeared behind the central reserve 22 minutes later, when the reserve had already committed half of its ships to cover the holes opened by the other groups. Vance was on the command deck of a ship most people in the solar system believed had been deactivated 20 years ago, coordinating 17 groups operating with real autonomy and drinking coffee. This was the detail Veth Kalan would mention years later, in an interview for a historical archive, that during the interception of communications from the human fleet, Concord signal analysts had been disturbed not by the tactical communications, which were professional and efficient, but by the informal communications. Humans communicating with each other during combat, making jokes, reminding each other to pay lost bets, exchanging recipes. One of the independent freighters had transmitted on an open frequency during the most intense phase of the battle, a song someone had played on a guitar. Concord species did not do that. Combat was combat. There was a protocol. Vance had explained this to Mensa weeks earlier during planning. The Concord thinks emotional stability in combat means absence of emotion. We discovered, after millennia of conflict among ourselves, that it means the opposite. You don't turn off what makes you human to fight better. You use it. The team that laughs together isn't being undisciplined. It's reinforcing the bonds that make someone cover your sector even when pure logic would say to retreat. At 11 hours of combat, the Concord defense formation had been fragmented into independent sectors that could no longer achieve effective, centralized coordination. There was no mass destruction, no ships annihilated in large numbers. There were ships paralyzed with compromised propulsion systems, communication lines surgically severed by the autonomous groups, the Central Reserve isolated from the layers it was supposed to protect. Veth Kalan issued the cessation of hostility signal at 11 hours and 23 minutes. Vance received confirmation of the signal and stared at the status screen for a long moment. Beside her, General Mensa held his own cup of coffee, his second of the day, and waited. "Now comes the hard part," she said. Mensa nodded. Any veteran knew that winning the battle was just the beginning of the more complex task, deciding what to do with the victory. Vance opened the galactic transmission channel and began to prepare the words she had spent weeks writing, rewriting, and discarding until she arrived at the version that said exactly what needed to be said, not a word more or less. The capital world of the galactic Concord was called Valinor Prime, and it was, by any reasonable metric of assessment, impressive. 3 continents, 2 greenish-blue oceans that sensors identified as rich in copper compounds, an atmosphere of nitrogen and oxygen with proportions slightly different from Earth's, but which most humans could breathe without assistance for several hours. 4 billion Valinari inhabitants, and an orbital infrastructure that had been built over 500 years, with the peaceful patience of those who had never needed to defend the planet against anything because no one had dared to try. Until now. The Sovereign Reckoning fleet had arrived in orbit of Valinor Prime on the 48th day after the disarmament agreement. 329 ships, including the 6 prototypes that continued to exist only in the real world and not in any official catalog. They had left the Orth Nebula after the cessation of hostilities, traversed the intermediate space at cruising speed, and arrived without incident because word of what had happened in the nebula had traveled faster than them through Concord communication channels. Vance had ordered the fleet to remain in containment orbit. No active weapon systems pointed at the surface. No interference with civilian navigation routes. The fleet was present in a way that was impossible to ignore, but did not constitute, by the technical definitions of all relevant interstellar treaties, an act of aggression. It was, in the terms she had presented to her legal officer during preparation, a position of demonstrated authority, not exercised. The senior counsel had requested immediate communication. Vance had responded that she would be available in 2 hours. She had spent those 2 hours doing 3 things: reviewing the transmission text, verifying that Captain Webb and the crews at Orth 7 Relay Station were in the process of being released under the cessation of hostilities agreement, and drinking a cup of green tea she had brought from home because there were things you did before, moments that could define the course of a civilization, and one of them was drinking tea. When the galactic channel was opened, Vance's transmission simultaneously reached all Concord member systems, all Frontier communication stations, and, via a secondary routing that Dr. Neal had configured with the precision of someone who had studied communications engineering for 20 years, the independent freighter networks and civilian channels of all species the Concord had classified as second-category members over the past 5 decades. Vance spoke for 14 minutes and 37 seconds. There was no teleprompter, no paper notes. There were only the words she had written and rewritten until each of them said exactly what needed to be said. She began with the facts. The disarmament agreement, the fleet transfer. What had happened to the ships and crews in the Vega 9th sector, with Lieutenant Commander Anders's report as the primary document. The leaked document that Earth intelligence analysts had recovered and that described humanity as a stability risk to be neutralized. The deliberate policy that had been presented as diplomacy, she spoke about it without embellishment, without the emotional overlay that could turn facts into propaganda. These were facts. They could be verified. She provided the archive numbers for each piece of evidence and announced that they would be made public in all systems simultaneously with the end of the transmission. Then she spoke about what humanity wanted. We did not come to Valinor Prime to destroy or replace. That would be unworthy of us and unworthy of what we believe interstellar space can be. We came to establish, with the authority earned in these past days, a condition that cannot be ignored or renegotiated at the convenience of those with more power. The Galactic Concord, in its current structure, is an aristocracy disguised as a meritocracy. The ancient races determine who deserves protection, who deserves representation, who deserves to continue existing without interference. This is not stability, it is control. And control maintained by the exclusion of voices is not peace. It is the absence of conflict through the absence of capacity for resistance. We do not accept this. We will not accept this. In its place, we propose the Galactic Assembly of Sovereign Peoples. Equal representation for all species, regardless of age, technology, or territory. No species with permanent veto power over decisions affecting others. An interspecies judicial review mechanism for agreements involving the transfer of military capabilities or sovereignty, and a fundamental principle coded into all founding treaties. No species can be classified as a risk to be neutralized without the knowledge and consent of that species itself. She paused. On the command deck, Mensa stood by the panoramic window. The hybrid prototypes were visible in formation, silent and impossible to catalog, and below them the curve of Valinor Prime stretched out with the indifferent beauty of a planet that had existed long before any talk of politics and would exist long after. We are aware, Vance continued, that this proposal will disrupt structures that have existed for centuries. We are aware that there are species in this Concord that did not participate in the decisions that led us to this moment, and who will suffer the turbulence of transition through no fault of their own. To these species, we offer partnership. To the structures that chose this policy, we offer the opportunity to reform before reform is externally imposed. And to all who hear this transmission, in any system, of any species who recognize themselves in the words I have spoken, who know what it is to be classified as a logistical byproduct or a stability risk by the powerful, the assembly we have proposed will have a seat for you. Find us. We will be here. The transmission ended. The galactic channel remained open for another 40 seconds in silence before someone, at some communication station in some distant system, initiated the response protocol. Mensa turned from where he had been observing through the window. And now? Vance placed the empty cup on the navigation console. Now we wait to see who responds first, and how. And the fleet? The fleet remains in orbit. She looked at the curve of Valinor Prime. Not as a threat, as a reminder. That vigilance has a cost, and we are willing to pay it. The first response arrived in 19 minutes. It was not from the Concord. It was from a frontier system of a species called Tethvar, which had tried for 40 years to be accepted as a Concord member and had been categorically rejected for reasons that the now public internal Concord documents classified as biological profile incompatible with long-term reliability standards. The Tethvar representative's message was short. It simply stated that their system had heard the transmission and was willing to discuss the terms of accession to the new assembly. In the following days, more would come. Some from species the Concord had excluded, others from member species who, when they saw the internal documents made public, concluded that the structure they defended was not what they thought it was. Vreth Allen would never transmit a public response, but their internal files, discovered months later during the Provisional Assembly's investigations, would reveal the note they had written to their aides on the day of Vance's transmission. The note read, translated literally from Valinari, "We calculated that humans would need 3 generations to be a threat. We miscalculated. The Galactic Assembly of Sovereign Peoples was formally constituted 6 months later, in a ceremony no one would describe as elegant, because elegance was not the goal. It was noisy, full of disputes over representation and protocol, traversed by simultaneous interpretations in 47 languages, and by at least 2 minor diplomatic incidents that were later recognized as linguistic misunderstandings. It was exactly the kind of institution that happens when you try to include everyone instead of selecting who deserves to be there. It was, in other words, a beginning. The Earth fleet remained mobilized, not in a posture of war, but in a posture of presence, patrolling frontier routes and participating in the new Assembly's first collaborative security missions. There were those who thought humanity should disarm now, that maintaining the fleet contradicted the values Vance had proclaimed. Vance had a standard answer to that question, which she always gave with the same patience, because she understood it was a good question asked in good faith. Peace you cannot defend is not peace. It is hope. Hope is precious, but it is fragile. Peace you can defend, that is something else. That is a choice you make every day, with your eyes open, aware of the cost of maintaining that choice. Thomas Royce returned to trade routes. There was more demand than ever for independent freighters on the routes opening up between systems that had previously had restricted access by the conquered. The Dark Hope was profiting. That was good. It was the most normal and everyday thing in the universe, and Royce had discovered, after weeks where normal and everyday had seemed like concepts from another cosmos, that normality was extraordinarily underestimated. Captain Marcus Webb was promoted to 2nd Squadron Admiral of the new unified Earth Fleet. He accepted the promotion, installed a copy of the synthetic leather hardcover book in his new cabin, opened to page 143, and continued to do what he had always done: observe rooms, listen to what was not being said, and keep the clean maintenance cloth in the bottom drawer of the navigation console for when the engines needed attention. Dr. Priya Neal was appointed director of the new Interspecies Propulsion Institute, the Assembly's first institution specifically dedicated to developing technologies no civilization had considered because they were too busy protecting what they already knew. She accepted the position on the condition that the lab have coffee available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The coffee was, technically, mildly toxic to 6 of the Assembly's member species. This inadvertently became the first regulatory item debated in the new Interspecies Forum. The discussion lasted 3 days and ended with an agreement establishing separate consumption zones and a formal resolution recognizing that stimulant substances with variable interspecies effects were a matter of individual sovereignty and not collective regulation. It was the first of many resolutions the old universe would not know how to categorize. And deep within Mars, in the Alpha Niner tunnels that now had open classification and maintenance teams with regularized budgets, General Mensa continued doing what he had always done. He checked the alignment of the accelerators. He updated the maintenance logs. He kept the ships ready, because vigilance was the price of freedom, and humanity had learned, in the most costly way possible, that this price was honest and fair and should be paid with open eyes, without bitterness, as an investment, and not as a burden. The universe now knew. Humans observed. And they did not stop until the job was done. End of story. If the tenacity of the human crew inspired you, Subscribe to the channel for more chronicles from the galactic frontier, because the story of humanity among the stars is still being written, and the next transmission might arrive when you least expect it.